Hi, everyone. Can you hear me, Karama? I just want to do a check.
I can hear you, Melody.
All right, thanks. All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on the Youth Homelessness Demonstration Program, RFP for Bridge Housing. This is Melody Conkis from the Mayor's Office of Homeless Services, and presenting this with me will be Paroma Nandi, also from the Mayor's Office of Homeless Services. So today we plan on sharing more information about the funding opportunity for the Crisis Bridge Housing. So some housekeeping for today. Today's webinar is going to be recorded and will be shared on the MOHS website. All attendees are muted to prevent background noise. And you may submit questions using the box to the right, and Elion from the COC and Tom is also with us from CHS, and they will help provide answer any of your questions during the webinar. We will also be leaving some space for Q&A at the end of the presentation. And if we do not answer your questions, you may follow up at HSP applications at baltimorecity.gov. YHDP overview. YHDP is a national demonstration program to support communities in the development and implementation of a coordinated community approach to preventing and ending youth homelessness. In August 2019, Baltimore City was selected in the third round, and we have been awarded about $3.7 million, along with 22 other communities in the round 3 cohort, awarded $75 million total. Shortly after Baltimore was awarded in September, MOHS and local stakeholders met for a kickoff meeting to start the YHDP Planning Committee. Participation has included attendance at 2 monthly meetings, as well as monthly full-day planning sessions with the technical assistant team. Activities the committee has worked on include reviewing data, providing feedback on current systems, and creating the Coordinated Community Plan, also known as the CCP. In March, the YHDP Planning Committee and the Youth Action Board decided on 5 project types, including rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing, family-based setting, diversion, and crisis bridge housing. Also, it's a type of transitional housing. As a YHDP recipient, Baltimore City received technical support from 4 agencies, including CHS, our lead TA team, that work with us on a weekly basis to provide support on the planning process. Also, True Colors provides support to ensure youth authentic involvement. We also work with the Partner Center for data collection. And the National Center for Homeless Education is our education partner and provides support to meet the educational goals of youth and young adults in Baltimore City. As a community, we have been selected as one of the 10 communities in round 3 to receive intensive education support. A few key elements of being a YHDP recipient. The first is creating a coordinated community plan. The past year, the Youth Action Board and YHDP Planning Committee have been involved in creating the CCP. The CCP is a plan on how Baltimore City as a community can prevent and end youth homelessness with comprehensive strategies beyond the YHDP grant funding. It includes key system partner goals such as education, employment, child welfare, justice, and behavioral and physical health, as well as incorporating a set of values and principles, including trauma-informed care, positive youth development, family engagement, and youth choice. The second key element is the Youth Action Board, or YAB. The Youth Action Board is a decision-making body consisting of youth and young adults with lived experience of housing instability and homelessness. HUD requires a Youth Action Board and for the board to have decision-making ability within the grant's governance. YAB is also part of approving, selecting, and providing feedback for YHDP projects, and no community can submit their CCP or YHDP projects without the YAB approval. A little bit about the Youth Action Board. In November, the Youth Action Board expanded from 4 to 10 members. The Youth Action Board meets twice a month and are compensated for all of their time and their work. 4 of the Youth Action Board members are part of the YHDP Planning Committee in addition to the YAB collaboration. YHDP projects are funded by federal grant dollars provided by HUD. The funding initial funding is for 2-year grants, but after the 2 years funding, it is renewable on an annual basis under the COC competition. So eligibility for YHDP. Applicants must be a nonprofit or another city government agency, be located or provide services in Baltimore City, have a commitment to operating the program under the Housing First model, at least a 25% cash or in-kind match for the amount of funding requested. Applicants may submit joint applications in response to the RFP. So when submitting your application, you will need to submit the following documentation. You need to provide a federal tax exempt determination letter, articles of incorporation and bylaws, current good standing from the state of Maryland, current list of board of directors, project organizational chart for the project you are submitting, and your most recent A-133 or independent financial audit, proof of ownership or lease agreement, and match documentation. We do encourage agencies to apply whether or not they can document the full 25% match and demonstrate the extent to which they can provide match. Okay. When submitting, yeah. Okay. The following must be completed inside to move to the review and scoring phase. So 1, complete application in PDF with required signatures submitted by the deadline. The budget workbook and narrative, MOHS Fair Housing Policy Statement and Agreement, MOHS Housing First Policy Agreement, and the Conflict of Interest Questionnaire and limits to primary religious organizations, and this can all be found in the RFP. And the match requirement is at least 25% cash or in kind. The recipient must match all grant funds except for leasing funds with no less than 25% of or in kind of cash or in kind contributions from other sources. All COC program costs and match sources must be in your approved budget. Match does not have to be used on the same budget line item as the grant funding, but does need to be used on activities for the project that otherwise would have been eligible to be funded with COC program funds. Match must be committed prior to grant agreement, and recipients must document all costs paid with match throughout the period of the YHDP grant. Eligible forms of match are cash or in-kind contributions. Cash is the recipient or subrecipient may use funds from any source, including any other federal sources, excluding COC program funds, as well as state, local, and private sources, provided that funds from the source are not statutorily prohibited to be used as match. Used to cover costs that would have been eligible or be paid for with COC program funds. In-kind contributions could be services and goods and could be used to cover costs that would have been eligible to be paid for with COC program funds. Okay. So YHDP funds can serve youth and young adults at risk of experiencing homelessness. Youth are minors under the age of 18 and young adults are aged 18 to 24. Up to 25. This also includes youth and young adults who are pregnant and or caring for one or more children, including the care of minor siblings. So what does this mean to experience homelessness? Experiencing literal homelessness could include living on the streets, in cars, places not for human habitation or shelters, and this would be categorized as HUD Category 1. At imminent risk of homelessness, within 14 days of losing housing, HUD Category 2, or feeling unsafe situations, or fleeing unsafe situations. Any situation a youth declares unsafe and wants to leave, including abusive, physical and emotional, non-LGBTQ affirming, drugs or alcohol, sexual exploitation, and this would be considered under HUD Category 4. So we want to make sure that there are special efforts serving the youth and young adults, including LGBTQ+, unaccompanied minors, pregnant and parenting youth, youth of color, foster care involved, justice involved, survivors of trafficking and exploitation, and immigrant and undocumented youth. As of July 1st, the House Bill 206 gives unaccompanied youth or youth at risk of experiencing homelessness the legal capacity to consent to shelter, housing, and supportive services without parental consent. Any public or private nonprofit organization that provides shelter or supportive services to minors in need of shelter must register with the Maryland Department of Housing and Community Development. DHCD will annually certify that providers meet certain conditions, including running background checks on employees, providing mandatory reporting training for employees, and requiring service providers to develop and implement procedures to screen staff members who work with minors.
Thanks, Melody, for the first half of that presentation. This is Paroma, and I'll be going through the next half. So YHDP has a set of guiding principles. All of these can be found in significant detail at the Baltimore City's Coordinated Community Plan. Once these slides, at the end of this presentation, the slides will be sent out to all attendees and posted to our website. But the CCP is also available publicly on MOHS's website. So just going through quickly the guiding principles. One is the USICH Youth Framework and the 4 outcomes, which we'll go into a little bit more detail on another slide, but just to discuss this quickly, the 4 outcomes of stable housing, permanent connections, education and employment, and social and emotional well-being. And then the guiding principles that are outlined in the CCP, the response to special populations, as Melody mentioned earlier. The projects are looking to ensure that we are serving youth of color, minors, foster care involved, justice involved, survivors of violence, immigrant and undocumented youth, and LGBTQ+ populations. We'll go into a little bit of detail about equity and positive youth development and trauma-informed care. Projects should include information on evidence-based resources as practices within the projects, family engagement, immediate access to housing with no preconditions, also known as housing first, youth choice, individualized and client-driven supports, social and community integration, and then connection within Baltimore City's youth coordinated entry system. You can go to the next slide. So one of the examples of the YHDP guiding principles is equity. So both on a national and local reports and ongoing through our HMIS analysis, we've indicated significant racial disparities within our homeless service system and across other systems. And so we want to ensure that projects that are applying for funding through YHDP address equity in their project proposals, and something to consider when they're developing their project design, ensuring that there is training involved for their staff and services involved thinking about equity and so on. So again, there's a Spark study that we can also share. I think it's attached to the resources, but something to consider when developing your project and your application. You can go to the next slide. So again, as I mentioned earlier before, the USICH Youth Framework and the four core outcomes, stable housing, permanent connections, education and employment, and social emotional well-being. Again, the CCP goes into a great amount of detail describing these four outcomes. It provides some local data that you can review as well when it comes to these four outcomes. And again, something you want to consider as you develop your project proposal. Next slide. So a little bit more about crisis bridge housing. So earlier we mentioned that Baltimore was awarded a little bit of over $3.6 million. Earlier this year, we had selected 4 other project types, rapid rehousing, a permanent supportive housing, and 2 supportive services projects, one a family-based setting and another a diversion and kinship project. What's available currently is what we call crisis bridge housing. The YHDP Crisis Bridge Housing Project will offer crisis housing for unaccompanied minors and youth who are experiencing homelessness. The goal of this project is to offer short-term assistance, 1 to 3 months of crisis housing, and may actually be considered a shelter alternative. The available funding is for the first year is $244,000. And then again, the project would be a 2-year project. So some project requirements. The project must comply with the Baltimore City COC policies and procedures, the HUD COC program interim rules, and then the YHDP NOFA and any HUD approved waivers. Use of Baltimore City's HMIS and provide accurate reporting. The utilization of Baltimore City's coordinated access system. Collaborative work within the COC's Youth Homelessness Action Committee, also known as the YHDP Planning Committee, involvement with the Youth Action Board and other committees within the COC. Have a plan for rapid implementation of the project, and the idea would be that all projects should begin enrolling clients within 3 months of the grant agreement. In the RFP, there's a question that you can detail your project timeline, and we would want to see that again, that the projects have a rapid start date. Work with DHCD around licensing requirements if the project serves unaccompanied minors. Next slide. The implementation of a housing first model that again incorporates many different evidence-based practices that include trauma-informed care, positive youth development, some other things, progressive engagement, and ongoing trainings on various topics through YHDP through both the YHDP Planning Committee and then other learning collaboratives and community calls through our HUD TA. Incorporates youth and young adults with lived experience of being homeless throughout the project planning design. And again, this is extremely important when we're thinking about our guiding principles. The project should emphasize youth choice and youth involvement throughout the project development and then the implementation. Adhere to housing first practices and ensuring that there are no barriers to housing or any prerequisite requirements such as sobriety or employment or income to access this project or access this program. Fair housing compliance. Again, this is part of our threshold requirements. And you can see an assigned agreement with MOHS within the RFP process. Local hiring, again, if the contract was to exceed $300,000, again, this project does not at this time. So, but if it was, it would need to follow the local hiring requirements and then required insurance coverage. So just a little bit of details about what is Housing First. Homelessness is first and foremost a housing problem and should be treated as such. So YHDP, the COC, and MOHS all believe that housing is a right to which all are entitled to. Issues that may have contributed to a household's homelessness can best be addressed once housed. And so, again, we're looking for projects to use evidence-based evidence-based policies to ensure that supportive services are offered but not required. And then people who are homeless or on the verge of homelessness should not be returned to homelessness. So again, ensuring that when housing is offered, that it's permanent and there's no preconditions and it is a stabilizing factor. You can go to the next slide. This is just a quick overview of the Housing First Agreement. Again, all providers that apply for this project are required to sign this agreement. Next slide. So coordinated access, again, we go into a fair amount of detail in the CCP about coordinating with the coordinated access system. Baltimore City uses this CA system. It's a centralized and standard system that prioritizes housing and services for individuals and families experiencing homelessness. Currently, it's only operational for entry into permanent housing programs such as permanent supportive housing and rapid rehousing. However, with the implementation of YHDP and the CCP, the YHDP Action Committee will be working on developing a youth-centric coordinated access system. Next slide. The Homeless Management Information System, also known as HMIS, is the centralized database that all providers must use to enter client and programmatic data. So if you are selected as the recipient of YHDP, you'll be required to use this. However, MOHS provides technical assistance and training if you haven't used it before. HMIS is also, there's a number of policies and procedures that are created locally, but are all in accordance with the federal regulations. Okay. Next slide, sorry. So YHDP waivers, also known as special activities. There are a number, because it's a demonstration program, HUD has allowed for communities to apply for special waivers. At your project application, you're not required to indicate any waivers that you plan on applying for, but we want providers to understand that this is an opportunity once selected. And so to think about that when developing their project proposals. Just some examples of potential waivers that you could look to include in your project, such as like cost of cell phone and monthly internet, cost of toiletries, use of admin funds for trainings or conferences. Again, there are a lot of different options when thinking about how to use some of these YHDP waivers, but again, something to consider, but not something that needs to be identified within the project proposal at this time. Next slide. So some more details about the application. All applications need to be submitted electronically, and all documents should be sent to the HSP applications at baltimorecity.gov. We will not be accepting any paper faxed applications, and the deadline to submit the applications is 4 p.m. on September 18th. Another slide has the timeline. Any questions before? We also have a deadline for questions, and those can also be submitted to the HSP applications email address. So all applications will be scored through a YHDP review committee. The sections are have maximum scores based off each section and the priority. So interest in project and the project understanding, the agency experience. You can see project design has the maximum number of points you can get. And then youth involvement and leadership and the alignment with the coordinated community plan. It's very important to make sure that you read through the coordinated community plan to fully understand the next step for YHDP. Project budgets. So attached, you'll see our project budgets. There's two options when applying, and we'll go into a little bit more detail when we talk about the eligible costs, but you'll enter the estimated cost for your proposed programs for all the funding categories. Oh, thanks, Melody. So you'll see there is two options with this project. You could apply for rental assistance, supportive services, HMIS, and administrative costs, or you can apply for leasing, operations, supportive services, HMIS, and administrative costs. So the difference is that if you apply for rental assistance, you cannot apply for leasing and operations, and if you apply for leasing and operations, you can't apply for rental assistance. But again, if you have additional questions about this, you can email us directly. Yeah, and you'll see in the budget that there are specific areas where there are eligible costs. So the rental assistance uses the fair market rent for FY 2019. And then, if you're applying for leasing without rental assistance, you would add that information in there. There are areas that are eligible costs under operations, such as maintenance, furniture, equipment, so and so. And then in supportive services, you'll also see a number of eligible costs, such as case management, education services, health services, transportation, food. All of those are eligible costs within the project. The Excel budget also has formulas attached to it, so it should give you a final calculation in the end. We'd also like to be able to see if there are other funds that you're using to support this project. You can add that into the narrative of your budget. All right, so again, as I was mentioning before, so you'll see the Bridge Housing Project is eligible for all 5 project costs, and you'll see that there is leasing, rental assistance, supportive service, operations, HMIS, and admin. I'll quickly just again go over the supportive services, HMIS, and admin, since you are eligible to apply for that whichever way you go. And again, supportive services includes a wide range of services such as case management, assistance with moving costs, client assistance, food, and counseling. And then HMIS is staffing and equipment costs, and then admin. It's you'll see that there's a 10% admin already included in a formula within the project budget. 5% goes directly to the provider, and 5% goes to MOHS for monitoring, the environmental review, and other activities that are included in the overhead and management of the programs. And then to go into a little bit more detail, so for crisis bridge housing, there are two different ways to operate this project. One through rental assistance, so this would be more of a scattered site housing option where the lease is between the client and housing owner. There's a written rental assistance agreement. Potentially the client may pay for a portion of the rent, and so that's one option. The other option is leasing or supportive services. You typically see this in a project-based project, I guess, and it's where the lease is between the service provider and the unit owner, and that the client is the sublease of the service provider, and that you're eligible under this funding stream to also apply for operation costs, so taxes and insurance on the property, maintenance and repair, security, utilities, furniture and equipment can all be included for the leasing if you're applying for the project with leasing. Additionally, when we're thinking about the target population, there are some, if you need more information on this, I recommend asking some questions so our head TA can follow up or emailing us directly. But there are some differences when thinking about the target population. So if your project is proposing to support both youth 18 to 24 and or minors, there are some differences in how you can how minors can access the unit. So typically minors may not be able to sign a lease agreement on their own. However, if you need more information on how they could do this, we'd be happy to provide that in more detail. Okay, next slide. So the timeline that I mentioned, again, the RFP was released July 24th. Today is our Technical Assistance Bidders Conference. The deadline to submit any questions is September 8th. The reason why we do that is so we can review all the questions and provide a thorough FAQ, and we will post that to the MOHS website. So, you know, if one provider asks a question, we can share it with many other people that are also interested. The RFP deadline, again, is September 18th at 4 p.m. Everything should be submitted electronically. The review and scoring will occur after that at the end of September. And then the selection should be made by October with a conditional funding letter sent out to the provider that's selected. After that, we will need to submit the actual project to HUD using their eSNAP portal. Once it's approved by HUD, there should be the tentative date for grant agreements is November, and the tentative start date would be January. So I'm going to just mute myself so that we have a few minutes to gather questions. So you can use the questions box on the side to ask any questions. And then again, we'll just be taking a brief pause and giving people a few minutes to gather their thoughts and ask away. And then we'll have a short Q&A session. And again, just this slide indicates that the last date to submit questions is September 8th, and they can be sent to the HSP applications at baltimorecity.gov. All right, we will be going on mute.
Hey everyone, Paroma and Melody, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Hi everyone, my name is Tom Haskin. I'm with CSH, part of the HUD Technical Assistance team, working with Baltimore on the YHDP demo grant. And we got a question that came through the chat, which was a good question, which was, is there a preference for existing or new programs? So I take that to mean, does a project, this is right for a, kind of like a crisis bridge housing project. Does that project for young people already have to exist in the community? Is this a new funding stream for it? Or can an agency that doesn't currently run a program like that apply for this funding? And the answer is either. YHDP money is intended to bring kind of new resources into communities to fund potentially new projects, but that doesn't mean that an agency that already exists and a provider that already does similar work couldn't apply for this funding as long as the kind of like program and activities meet the criteria that Paroma and Melody have been outlining in this RFP. I hope that answers the question. But typically we do think of YHDP projects as being new projects in a community, new programs. But if you're doing something similar and you're looking to expand that work, as long as it kind of meets all of the requirements for the population that we're trying to serve here, and the type of housing and the length of assistance and the service package, you could totally apply.
All right, we'll give a couple more minutes to see if there's any more questions. If there's any questions, just feel free to drop that in the chat box.
Hey, we just had a question come in about organizations submitting multiple applications for separate programs. I don't want to speak out of turn too much, so I definitely defer to the folks from the mayor's office and Journey Home on this. But the funding amount that's available, I believe, is like $244,000 for 1 year for transitional housing project is the kind of like HUD program component. I think that, you know, an agency could put together a package that maybe is 2 separate projects, for example, 1 leasing project and one project utilizing rental assistance. If you're looking to serve maybe 18 and over in a separate project from unaccompanied minors, that could be a reason to submit multiple projects, but it would all have to be transitional housing projects in this kind of like crisis bridge housing mold. You also might submit a project application, for example, that doesn't cover the full dollar amount if you feel like, you know, that's more capacity than you're able to provide. It's not a huge dollar amount for a project, but I suppose that that's possible. In which case, I'm sure this city would be looking to have a second provider come in to meet that full dollar amount for this project. So I think long story short, possible that you could have multiple projects within this TH project component. But I don't know if the planning committee made any recommendations around selecting a single provider in a single project, or a single provider in multiple projects, or multiple providers and multiple projects. To me, those would all be on the table at this juncture, but there could be some kind of local decisions that have been made about that. Paroma, would you add anything on that front?
Yeah, I would just say thanks, Tom, for giving that detail. And yeah, I think there hasn't been a specific decision on whether the YHDP review committee would accept multiple applications for this program. I think the limitations is the funding amount is set. And so if a organization wanted to apply for multiple or separate programs, they would have to probably give enough evidence of how they would be able to support that with the available funding, or if they were bringing in other dollars or leveraging other dollars through match, how that would work, and the purpose of it being separate, whether it was like serving different populations, or one project serving minors and another serving, you know, youth 18 to 24. Something like that. So I think, again, it's all on the table. If you do have like something a little bit more specific, I would encourage you to, you know, send us an email, giving us a little bit more, probably a little bit more details about what you're thinking about when applying for separate programs. There was another question about giving examples of projects that we would fund. And so I just wanted to go into a little bit of detail of the Youth Action Board and the YHDP Planning Committee did an entire system review within Baltimore City, looking at the number of youth that were experiencing homelessness and the current programs and services that were available. And through that planning, it was determined that a crisis bridge housing that would be operated like a short-term transitional housing project was necessary. There is very few youth shelter beds, and from our research and our discussions with the Youth Action Board, it was very evident that many youth are either not welcome, don't feel welcome or safe, or don't always access more of the adult-centric centers of like emergency shelter. So it was very important that the YHDP projects included a crisis bridge housing, specifically to think about our target population and special populations that we serve. And again, so looking at the RFP, I would say just making sure that you consider the special populations, the short-term emergency services and shelter component slash rental assistance component, and the idea that that you would be connecting to permanent housing. So one of the things that it's outlined in this project is that it's like 1 to 3 months of housing assistance, but the idea would be that youth or minors that enter this project will be connected to some sort of permanent solution, whether that's rapid rehousing or permanent supportive housing or family reunification or another permanent solution. So just thinking about it that way.
And I would just kind of add to that, right? Like there have been 2 other projects that have been RFP'd out and awarded in the kind of first round of this process in Baltimore. I think that kind of happened in May and June, and that was a diversion project and kind of family kinship-based support project. And those projects both contain elements that are similar to host homes, where young people can either identify biological family, fictive kin, other supports in their community that they could stay in kind of a host home scenario, or I think there might be a component of those host homes where you kind of have a roster of folks in the community who have volunteered to serve as hosts, and I would kind of call that more like a stranger situation, hopefully without too much of a negative connotation. But I think the young people and the planning committee identified a need for something more similar to shelter, where you're not, you don't need to have a network of folks around you. Some young folks might not be able to identify an older adult where they could stay, or might not feel comfortable going into someone else's home that they don't know. So this kind of crisis bridge project was, I think, intended to fill that kind of gap. And to be a place where a young person could be 1 to 3 months, and like Param is saying, then kind of bridge into a permanent housing solution like rapid rehousing or their own unit on the private market. So that was kind of the intention, I think, if I'm recalling correctly, of the Crisis Bridge Housing Project in Baltimore. I think there's a question here about the YAB, the role of the YAB and the planning committee members on working. I don't know if it's about feedback or scoring of the projects, but maybe someone from the mayor's office could take a stab at how these projects are kind of reviewed and scored and awarded. And when I say these projects, I mean, we're only looking at one project now, the TH project in this round of the RFP.
Yeah, I can answer that. This is Melody. So they are, like, everybody is neutral, so we make sure that nobody has like a conflict of interest when scoring these projects. But the Youth Action Board and the YHDP committee will kind of work to score the projects. And with that, so looking at projects, so there might be recommendations of making sure that there's youth involvement and that youth are getting paid for their time. So they are kind of there to support the YHDP process. So I guess to that, it's, yeah, they're also there to kind of just make sure, like, if those gaps are missing, that they provide that feedback from that youth and young adult perspective, along with the YHDP committee, knowing that they've worked on the CCP and like what might be missing in some applications.
And this is Paroma. Just to add to that, after the selection to the YAB and YHDP committee members, our neutral collaborators of the projects, they're there to provide feedback and recommendations, but they're also there to support the provider in ensuring that the elements of the CCP are implemented within Baltimore City. So there are a number of interventions and strategies that are outlined in the CCP that will not all be resolved with each provider's project, and so the YAB and YHDP committee are there to support that work to ensure that those elements are being met. And then another piece of it, if you are selected as the provider for this project, one of the requirements is that you do participate in that YHDP committee. So we have about 5 more minutes. I think we'll leave the portal open for any more questions, but I don't see any more at this time.
I think just one more thing is there were some questions about other communities, Paroma, and I would advise folks to go look at the coordinated community plans from rounds 1 and round 2 communities who have done YHDP to learn a little about the projects that they design and are now operating. I think communities that have done similar programs to this, and this is just kind of off the top of my head, but you should look around, are like in Connecticut, round 1 community has some kind of crisis TH. Kentucky, Balance of State, they definitely have crisis transitional housing. Southeast, I think it's Ohio Balance of State also has something like this, and maybe Seattle as well. So those are communities that you could go look for kind of the description of their projects. I mean, in some cases, those providers are already up and running.
Thanks, Tom. And yeah, we also just want to encourage providers on this call today to follow up with us at the HSP applications at baltimorecity.gov for any further questions, or when you're going through the RFP, and if you need any additional guidance, we will be available to answer anything.
All right, well, thank you, Paroma and Tom, and everybody who joined us on this call. You can follow us and join the conversation on social media. You can follow us on Twitter and Instagram. And again, just if you have any questions, please feel free to email us, and we can also set up a time to provide any other support that you may need. All right, thank you.